All right, good morning, class. Welcome to this new unit we're working on. We're going to be learning today about developmental psychology. So, this unit will all be about how people change over time, especially looking at childhood. The other part of this unit we'll cover a little bit later on is going to be about personality. But again, for the next 2 weeks or so, it's all going to be about developmental psychology. Right. So, our target, what are the major theories of development and what influences our life and behavior? For some of the stuff in this unit, it's going to be more scientific based. So, it's not going to be as much theories, but facts. But there are definitely many different psychological theories about how people obtain their personality and what causes them to change their behavior over time. Okay. So, a giant question is how much of your personality is based on your genetics? There's this eternal question in psychology: nature versus nurture. Most of the time, the answer is going to be a combination of the two. Yes, your genetics, those things you're born with, play a role, but so does the environment that you are raised in. So, some big questions for you guys to think about. How much do you think, how much of your life do you think is based on your environment and experiences? What examples can you draw from where you can kind of match things that happened in your environment to how you are as a person today? And then why might this be such a hard question to answer? And we'll look at some of the reasons why we have a lot of difficulty sometimes figuring out, is it more about your genetics or about your environment? So, in developmental psychology, we're asking a lot of questions, including what shapes the way we change over time. So, we are going to focus more on the psychological changes across the entire lifespan, but we're also going to be looking at these other perspectives as well. Every area of psychology can be looked at from this perspective. We look at the biological development, how are you physically changing? Your social development, how are you interacting with other peoples? Your cognitive and perceptual development, how your brain experiences the world, and then your personality development, how you interact with other people around you. Okay. So the biggest fundamental issue, nature versus nurture. What is the role of hereditary, excuse me, heredity versus environment in determining your psychological makeup? So heredity is those things that you are inheriting from your parents versus again your environment. So, one way we often measure intelligence in this country and around the world is there's something called IQ or intelligence quotient. Now, it's not a perfect score, but we do use it a lot. And we can ask questions like, is IQ inherited or determined by your early environment? Is there a criminal gene? If you grow up to become a criminal, is there anything you could have done about it? Or is there some genetic cause that is causing you to do these things that are illegal? Is sexual orientation a choice or genetically determined? Well, we'll talk a little bit about this question, but science has a very strong opinion on this in one formation. So these are some of our greatest societal debates, and it's often a mistake to think of them as either or. Your genetics as well as your environment are both always going to be impacting on the person that you are. Okay. Now, I know you guys have all probably taken some form of biology, hopefully by now, but there's a couple of things we got to understand. There is your genotype and there is your phenotype. So, your genotype is just the description of you based upon your inherited genetic materials. Now, then there is your phenotype, which is what you actually are today. So, you have your genes, and then you have the environment that influences it, and this creates the person you will become as your phenotype. And I'm going to use a picture as an example here to try to explain this. So this is actually at the demilitarized zone border in North Korea, between North and South Korea. As you guys are probably aware, there's a lot of issues between those two countries. There was a civil war, and the United States was involved in this war. In this image, you see a Caucasian American guy, a North Korean soldier in the middle, and then on the right-hand side, you see a South Korean soldier. Now, North Korea and South Korea have only been separated by a border for about 70 years now. So the genetic makeup of the people in the North and the South, it's a small country, are relatively similar. And yet today, we see a great difference in the height between those people from North Korea and those people from South Korea. These are soldiers. The average, I think, South Korean soldier, I think today is like 5'11". The average North Korean soldier is something like 5'4", 5'5". Now, their genetics are very similar, so why is the height so different? Well, this comes into our environmental influences. Today, South Korea is a very wealthy, prosperous country. Their people are given all the nutrition and the medical care they need. North Korea frequently suffers from food shortages and famines. Their people are not necessarily getting the food they need to grow to their maximum height. So, if this man in the middle, the North Korean, would have been born in the South, the chances are he would actually be much taller because he had access to better nutrition and to better resources. So even though their genetics might be similar, the environment is having a great role in how their outcomes are. And if you guys have any siblings that are very different from you, you might think about if they're raised in a different household, how that might infect them or excuse me, impact them as well. So again, this is just a couple of little basic vocabulary. Your genotype is your underlying genetic makeup. Your phenotype is the traits that are actually expressed in you. Your dominant genes will always be expressed if present, and then you have recessive genes that will not be expressed unless they are in a pair. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Mendel squares and going over how all this kind of stuff works. I'll just give you a little example. Um, we have a recessive gene that codes for red hair. I have some of that gene. I get it partially displayed in my phenotype in the form of my facial hair, although it is not a dominant gene that is taking over everything else. Eye color, skin color, these are all things that are mostly determined by your genetics, but of course, with your skin color, the environment does have a bigger role in that as well. Okay, so looking at a couple of charts here, we're saying how much is inherited between twins. So this is a study looking at, I think, 800 or 1,200 twin groups and seeing how related or how much can we determine is based on genetics. So if we look at the first one, for height for twins, they said about 80 to 85% of your height is determined entirely by your genetics. If you have tall parents, you're much more likely to be a tall person yourself. Although you see, even though genetics plays a giant role in determining your height, there is still room for some environmental impact. Are you eating the proper nutrition? Are you playing sports? Are you doing things that might make you become tall in the long run? I'm not saying playing sports makes you taller, but being active shows to have an increase in height later on in life. You see, weight is actually even more genetic than environmental, which might be surprising to some people, considering we might see more differences in weight between people based on what they choose to eat. Now, if we go down to some of these cognitive skills, we see there is a big genetic influence in reading and in math, as well as in our nonverbal skills, but it falls to less than 40% for verbal language when it comes to genetic inheritance. So there is, of course, something to be said for being born smart. Obviously, we know that kids at an early age often display tremendous differences in their cognitive abilities. However, this shows how much is actually determined by your environment. So if you think of language, were you exposed to books and words at an early age? Were you in a literate household compared to maybe somebody who was not? So we see these physical manifestations are much more influenced by genetics than kind of our mental skills. Okay. A couple other studies that are same thing. They're saying how much is there a correlation between people? And so DZ twins, these are non-identical twins. MZ twins would be identical twins, and then normal siblings, and then um, parent offspring, this means your cousins. And we see if they grew up in the same house, there's a very strong correlation for identical twins for their IQ. A score of 1.0 would be a perfect correlation. That means they have the exact same IQ. So we see a lot of similarities. However, as you go down the list, it becomes less and less of an influence. So even among you guys, if you don't have twin siblings, yes, you probably have a similar intelligence level to them, but there could be a lot of differences between them. Okay. So again, this is looking more at IQ, and I spent a lot of time on this because I think it's something that is misunderstood, whether people are born smart or not. And we see there is very strong genetic influences, but of course, the role of the environment is huge as well. Now, identical twins who are raised as part, all right, they share 100% of their genes, and you see they do have a pretty high, almost 80% correlation. And then that's actually stronger than any of these groups that are raised together. Okay, so environment does have an influence, but it looks like for IQ, genetics is a little bit more powerful. Now, I put up a couple of videos in my playlist. You guys can check out more about criminal genes. And there's kind of a criminal gene, kind of not. We haven't necessarily identified exactly what some of these are, although we do have some idea that these genes are related to dopamine, which is that pleasure chemical that's released in your brain. And they say that lifetime criminality is about 40 to 70% about your genetic heritage, which is kind of really strange. Okay. In the US, 5% of families account for half of all of the rest. Now, this also says there's not just genes, but who they're getting married to, and then, of course, what situation the kids are getting raised in. But even looking at adoption studies, they find that it relates more closely to the biological parent, if you'll be a criminal or not, than to your foster father. Okay, so obviously your environment still does have a big effect on it, but it seems like genetics is pretty strong. Not to go too personal, but I do have a number of criminals in my family, so it is not destiny that you have to follow along in this path. And I encourage you guys to check out some of those videos on YouTube that will maybe delve a little bit deeper into this idea of whether or not there are criminal genes. Okay. Now, it seems very strongly that development of sexual orientation is also biologically based. So they think that your inheritability for that is between 50 and 60% for women, 30% for men. And it seems that for people that identify as non heterosexual, either as homosexual or bisexual, there seems to be some sex hormones at play, especially during fetal development. A high dose of testosterone in women when they are pregnant appears as though it does might change the gender and not the gender, excuse me, the sexuality of the children. But I'm not going to get too much into this. I don't understand this stuff 100% as far as what argument they're trying to make here, but they're just showing there is some sort of genetic component to sexual orientation as well. Okay. So they've been all these giant studies. How much is heritable? How much is not heritable about your personality? And they say that across all your things, about 40% of your personality is due to your genetics, 60% is due to your environmental influences. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, but I'm so much like my parents, well, they are your genetics and your environmental influence. So they have a kind of double factor in how they are causing you to be raised up. Now, is development continuous over time? Development means change, and change can be abrupt or gradual. And we'll look at a couple of these theories of human development. There are the stage theories that says there are distinct phases to intellectual and personality development versus continuity, which says that development is continuously happening and doesn't make as much sense to separate into stages. Okay. Physical development begins at conception. Physical maturity sets limits on your psychological ability as well. Your visual system is not fully functional at birth, and your language system may not function until much, much later. But the prenatal environment can have a lifetime influence on health and intellectual ability. And by prenatal, that means before birth. So the environment you are in the womb inside of your mother, that can have a tremendous influence on what happens to you later on in life. I'm sure you guys have all seen some picture of this before. This is what you look like a long, long time ago. So, at about 3 months old inside of the mother, this is what the average human baby looks like. We can identify, of course, a couple of organs already: the eye, the ear, the spleen. We see our umbilical cord providing nutrients to the child, as well as that yolk sac, which is kind of where they store some of these nutrients. And what the mother eats is then processed and fed through the umbilical cord into the child. If you think about your belly button, that is where you used to get fed from your umbilical cord. And there's also, we got to remember, a really strong resemblance early on between children, human children, and other animals. Most fetus things start off looking very similar and then only diverge later on. So, what are the big prenatal or while pregnant influences on development? Nutrition is the most obvious one. What is the mother eating and putting inside of her body? This is often will determine what your child will want to eat, but also their weight when they come out. Anxiety is a huge one as well. And there's been a lot of research the last few years about epigenetics, which is not just what genetics you carry, but how they are processed and passed down. And there's been a lot of studies showing that the anxiety of the mother affects the anxiety of the child. If your mother was stressed out and struggling during her pregnancy, there's a much higher chance that you might have an anxiety disorder. The mother's general health, of course, is also very important. Are you being raised in a healthy environment? The age. Unfortunately, the older men and women, okay, both of them get, the more likely that a child they bear will have some sort of birth defect. So, age is also important. Obviously, we don't want young people having kids these days because we want them to go get an education and live their life. But delaying having children into your late 30s, not the most positive effect on your child. Okay. We also have tetragens, which are any of these agents that cause any kind of birth defects, drugs, radiation, viruses, etc. And of course, disease while the mother is pregnant can have a very negative impact as well. Okay. There's a couple of really sad cases. There was something called thalidomide, which was given mostly in Europe, I believe, initially to help women with morning sickness, feeling sick, and it unfortunately contributed to a lot of birth defects among children. We'll also talk a little about fetal alcohol syndrome here in a minute, which is what happens when women drink when they're pregnant. Okay, so this is comparing the brain of a normal child to that of one that had fetal alcohol syndrome. Now, this is something that a lot of physicians see a lot, and as teachers, we're kind of trained a little bit to look for this stuff too. But one of the most devastating things a mother can do while pregnant is to drink. And you see labels in most alcohol telling women not to drink when pregnant. The reason they tell them that is because it can have really damaging effects on the psychological and physical capabilities of their child. Now, fetal alcohol syndrome usually contributes to low intellectual ability, ADHD, and other problems as well. And there are some physical manifestations you can see here where you can look at a child and say, oh, they probably were exposed to alcohol inside of the womb. The philtrum, which is that kind of groove underneath your nose, tends to be thinner in people that had exposure to alcohol in the womb, as well as a thin upper lip and some other issues with their eyes. Once I learned about fetal alcohol syndrome and how to identify it, I started seeing it a lot in some of my students, unfortunately. Okay. Now, the more enriched a child's environment is going to be, the more neural networks will develop in their brain. So you want to make sure, even while in the womb, that there is some sort of stimulation happening for your child. Now, mostly this is just the mother living her normal day-to-day life, but there are a lot of companies like Baby Einstein that say playing music and stuff like that can help the child in the womb. We don't have any test results that show that stuff is actually effective. Okay. Now, talk a little bit about some of the abilities that infants are born with. They usually have a immature visual system. They can detect movements, large objects. There's some senses they can detect faces, but that's debated by some doctors. They can orient to sounds. They can turn away from unpleasant odors. Even at a very young age, they prefer sweet to sour taste. And kids are often born with, or they should be born with, a number of reflex behaviors. The three we'll leave you guys with today: rooting, which is trying to find where the nipple is, so turning the head and opening the mouth in the direction of a touch on the cheek. Sucking rhythmically in response to oral stimulation, so that once they find the nipple, being able to feed themselves. And then grasping, curling the fingers around an object. There are some more infant reflexes, including there's a standing reflex. If you put your child, like a newborn, and help them stand up, they will stand on their own. They actually lose this ability later on. And then one more fun one you should definitely not do any experiments with is that infants will automatically hold their breath. So if you have a newborn baby and you put them underwater, again, do not do this. They will shut their mouth and make sure they don't inhale any air. Okay. Now, I'm going to put up a couple links for a movie that I would like you guys to watch over the next week or two. Unfortunately, this movie is not available for anywhere free that I know. Amazon Prime does have it. I know that you can watch on YouTube for like $3 or something like that. There are some streaming services where you could also find this movie. There's one I use called Solar Movies that I was able to find right away, but I don't want you guys to feel like you are doing anything uncomfortable by streaming a movie online. But I really highly suggest you check it out because it will help us understand a little bit better this question of nature and nurture. So it's a story about three brothers, identical twin brothers or triplets, who were separated at birth and then raised apart. And it really helps us dive deeper into the question of nature versus nurture. I'll put up some readings and stuff for you guys this week as well for our first week. Please contact me if you have any questions. Again, I'm here to help and I'm here to make this stuff as interesting as possible. I know this is not what we foresaw ourselves doing this week, but hey, we're going to make the best of it. And again, reach out to me if you guys have any questions.